Thank you, everybody, for your time this afternoon and joining us for the session that we have in working through our BIM and FM survey results. My name is Joe Eichenseer. This is year 5 that we've been going through these results, which is pretty cool because we're starting to be able to get more and more as far as trends and how things are going. Now, granted, through here you got some amount of limitation that you'll be subject to the opinions that you'll have for both myself and my co-presenter, Peter Costanzo. But the overall agenda of what we'll have to go through today is brief introductions, talking about what we did for the survey, the results of that survey, some of the trends, some of the things that we'll be seeing through there. We'll get all sorts of color commentary as we're going through it all. And then, as always, opening it up at the end for questions and answers. As the questions are coming through, there's going to be a little typing panel for chat or for Q&A inside the WebEx Meeting Center. Let's go ahead and please be typing through there as we can. If you've got something that's specific, please be specific in the question. If you come back with a question of what did you mean by that, when we get to the Q&A portion at the end, we're not really going to know what that means. So moving from there then, again, my name is Joe Eichenseer. I'm the director of the Building Lifecycle Solutions technical team across North America, which essentially means I get to work with all of our trainers or consultants or people that have anything to do with buildings, whether it's design, construction, or facilities management. And joining us here together is Peter. Peter?
And slightly late. Apologize. I had technical difficulties, which kind of cracks me up because we're talking about technology. I head up our facilities management practice. I just hit my 15-year anniversary. And I can honestly say that I love my job. It's a very exciting time in BIM and facilities management, and I get involved in all sorts of discussions with all sorts of people as these technologies continue to get together. And there are definitely points at which they align very cleanly, and there are also some points which require a little massaging because they don't align completely together.
No doubt.
So the survey, this is our 5th year, and something just dawned on me as Joe asked for questions. We're going to go through, most of you who are on the webinar actually responded to the survey. I can see if you guys have suggestions of questions that you think might be helpful, we'd be happy to include them next year. We have added some things, but we've tried to make the survey pretty much the same year after year so we get the same amount. When I get to the next slide, I'll talk on this. I made a slight error in the survey because I was late. Last year, the International Facility Management Group, the Technology Council, was involved in our survey, and I pinged them a little too late this year, and we couldn't get out. And as a result, we had a couple fewer owners that we had in the past. That being said, though, our response rates continue to grow in this. So this year we had like about 400 respondents. Our results were skewed a little bit, and part of that is we saw less owners because we pinged less owners. One of the things that I'm very happy about when we look at 2018 versus 2019, we have more people responding that aren't architects. And I have nothing against architects, but there's a very high adoption rate of BIM in architects. And as we talk about the value proposition that BIM brings to the building life cycle, we're starting to see that the engineering and analysis and construction firm are becoming a bigger part of the respondents here. And that's good to see because as you talk about the value proposition of BIM, there definitely is inherent value in helping architects be more efficient in their work and communicate more clearly with owners during the design process, but there are tremendous efficiencies that can be gained during construction and in facilities management. And we'll talk about this a little later on, but there's an explosion of software and capabilities and different integrations in construction, so it's good to see that trend's continuing. So as we look, again, I mentioned we try to stay the same, but we added a new question this year. So the first was we kind of talked about just a general question looking at owners, hey, are you requiring BIM? And we looked at the last few years, and we can see that there is a trend to more people are requiring BIM. But the other thing that we realized in this, and part of this we attribute to we didn't include as many owners in our sampling size, but also there's a realization where I work with a lot of owners, and I've gotten on the phone with them the last few years, and I'll ask them if they're doing BIM. And they raise their hand and say, yes, absolutely, we're doing BIM. And when I start to delve into that, I ask, well, what that means. And they'll tell me, like, well, we have a BIM standard, and we copied it from someone else, so we're kind of using that. And then I'll say, well, are you enforcing that and making sure you get that data in? And the answer usually, very sadly, is no. And part of the reason is BIM, there's a level of work involved to implement that. And the best way I explain that is, and the architectural and design community understands this, BIM requires a paradigm shift. You work differently in BIM than you did in CAD. And part of what's happening as BIM is starting to become more with owners, I see where a couple years ago it was that buzzword. Remember there were years ago when the architects, every project we were doing was green, right? We had a green project. We're seeing more and more that people are starting to look at BIM and saying, hey, I'm asking BIM, I'm saying I'm doing BIM, but I really don't understand exactly what that means. And on one hand, that's a little bit negative because I see a little bit of a downturn. On the other hand, the number of organizations that we're engaging with and what we're seeing with in industry publications, people are really drilling into what it means to implement BIM at their particular owner organization. And also the fact that how they use BIM at their organization, while there definitely will be similarities between the different organizations, things will be used differently.
And then I'll take it from there to talking a little bit about some of this piece for the positions that owners are taking. As I see it, excuse me, there's a fair amount of consistency in here. The three columns on the left, what are you looking at getting out of BIM? So this was a question to the owners, what do you want to get from BIM? And we've been pretty consistent at a high level of, yes, we want to get information about space and assets. Consistency in looking for things for manufacturer specifications. Consistency, as I see it, in COBie or IFC-based data. COBie and IFC-based data, if you want to think about it, that as being the neutral file format that we can use to exchange data from just about any system to just about any other system. Got to take caution in it because as soon as you start talking about translating and not any direct integrations, translations always seem to have some level of a loss of information along the way. Now, what exactly might get lost or changed or whatever will vary, and you got to look into it just to know what you're getting into. But it's that neutral file format. It's like DXF for BIM, if you want to call it that. One of the things that I've been, as we were looking through here, and I've been happy to see, is the decrease in the number of people that are looking at information or gaining things from BIM as far as maintenance schedules go. Yeah, my opinion is certainly going to be that, we'll say a Revit model. In North America, BIM equals Revit. We can make that type of association. It's an imperfect piece, but it's pretty clear. That being said, maintenance schedules don't really belong in a model, in a building model. They tend to belong in a facilities software. Maybe they feed information into a building model from time to time, but BIM, in my opinion, is not the right place for maintenance schedules. So people less and less often looking for that type of data, to me, becomes a good thing because that means that from the owner side, there's a little bit more knowledge coming around as far as what BIM really is good for and trying to make sure we focus on those types of things. An interesting clash that I'm seeing is a decrease in the idea of requesting point clouds as part of that overall BIM process. There's still a fair number, an eighth of all owners are asking or looking for point cloud information. I would say that based off the activity that we see as a company, the emphasis on point clouds and capturing that data still is more heavily on the AEC firms, on the architecture construction firms, and less so on the owner side. It's obviously there, but it's a little bit less than it might be otherwise. So some interesting consistencies, and again, a trend that I see that is reflective of a general increase in knowledge about BIM amongst owners. Now, if we take that and flip it over to the AEC end, there's that question of how often are AEC firms working on BIM projects? Now, the clash that we've got in here is, yes, there's good steady growth. Now, again, how do you consider what is a BIM project and working on a BIM project? Everybody will have their own definitions. We're not trying to over-define that piece. But as people interpret that for themselves, it's growing. So we're nearly 70% of firms are always, very often, or often working on BIM-based projects. So from the interpretation side of this, if we compare that to how often owners are asking for it, there's the very, very easy and I think logical step that we can take that says that design firms, AEC firms, are working in a BIM environment whether or not an owner is asking for it. And that has some interesting things that we can maybe project from there as far as what might owners be able to do, or why aren't owners trying to take advantage of at least some of the low-hanging fruit type of data that exists out there, because we've got people working in that BIM environment. But I'll say it goes back to a communication thing, or knowing what we've got. There's dozens and dozens of reasons that can come through there, but there's this gap that we've got between those that are doing BIM through design and construction and those that are trying to consume BIM once we get into the owner and operation side of things. Now, one of the interesting things we did for this, we've been capturing this information for a while, but as Peter mentioned, we're looking to add some questions here and there. There's the idea of what type of facility solution are owners using? And as we're looking at that, there's a couple of reasons we're doing that, because the type of solution you're using could have an impact on what can you do with this whole idea of BIM. Is the solution that you put into place inside your facility something that can work with BIM data or connect with these other types of things, or is it really limited to AutoCAD, DWG, or other types of more common deliverables that are out there? We'll get into some of that data a little bit later too. The part that was interesting for me is as we start looking at things, say, well, how often are people using still Microsoft Excel? It's still a very, very predominant tool that we've got. And if we think about Excel, the common thought is Excel isn't a BIM tool. It's a data tool, sure, but it's not a BIM tool. You can make some arguments that it actually is part of the BIM process just because everybody uses it. But as I'm looking at this and making some of those comparisons, it's like, wow, that's a lot of people that are using Excel relative to IWMS, Integrated Workplace Management System, CAFM, all these different things. Then from the Joe side of things, so I'm coming more from the AEC world. Peter's coming more from the owner side. I'm thinking about things from my end, thinking, well, for me, for somebody that came up through architecture, engineering, construction, what's the difference between an IWMS and a CAFM, Computer-Aided Facilities Management, Integrated Workplace Management System? I don't care. To me, they're one and the same. A CAFM is the same thing as an IWMS, is the same thing as a CMMS, is the same thing. I know that there's differences between them based off of how they're presented, the feature sets that are all in there. But to me, an IWMS, a CAFM, and all these things are really the same. So one of the things we looked at this time around was breaking it into what are people actually doing according to this road. Now, Peter, maybe get your thoughts on that and where I might be wrong.
And I think part of as we kind of talk about Excel, I like the least common denominator. I always make fun of Excel. I've been in technology for over 25 years now, and the amount of time people look at a report and say, hey, that's great, will you put it in Excel? I can't get over what I hear. I joke that Microsoft should have called Excel the de facto reporting and data communication standard. And I think part of why Excel got put into play here, as we talk about COBE, which is one of the data interchanges associated with BIM, it is communicated at its core in a spreadsheet. the thing that's interesting as we start to look at technology adoption from owners, there has kind of been an explosion in terms of what's happened within the marketplace of different facilities management softwares. And when I got involved in this about 15 years ago, the maintenance management systems, the CMMSs, the CAFM systems, it was kind of more of a cottage industry. And a few things have happened, which I see people moving towards vendor solutions, which I think is very bright. If you're on the phone and you're looking for a solution and you're considering writing your own, don't write your own. There are hundreds of viable FM solutions out there from every angle, and there are more coming to market with each week. But a couple trends there. The first thing I just always like to point out to help the architects on the call and working with the owners. Owners have had places in the facility management systems to put important information like room information and asset information and details on assets for the last 30 years. These are standard IT table-based systems. And historically, you couldn't get that information from a CAD drawing into a system. So the fact that BIM is a way to help start to propagate this information and get it from the design phase over into the owners, it's a new delivery mechanism per se, but these aren't novel concepts. So if you think about it, if you're an owner and let's say you've got 100 type of HVAC units that do a certain thing, and let's say you've got a 50 Honeywell 123s and 50 Trane 456s. Well, one of the things they'll do is run metrics on those and see which ones are more efficient because they'll be looking to run better costs over time. They may learn things better how to maintain them. The second trend, if you use the term CAFM, which has kind of been replaced by IWMS and is used by everyone now, and IWMS stands for Integrated Workplace Management System, which is best described as a facilities management system that's kind of like an ERP for facilities and can do everything. Well, every major IWMS that's on the market has either been bought by a venture cap in the last few years or by a major computing power like an IBM and an Oracle. And the reason why I point this out, usually when you see a shift like that in IT, there is a movement in the IT world in a value proposition where the markets think that there are things to be sold. And BIM enables at a base level, and we'll touch on this specifically when we start to talk about IoT, a way to much better manage facilities. The other thing that I'm seeing in terms of vendor solutions, from a software perspective, it is very much easier to come to market with new software now than it was years ago. So if you wanted to start a maintenance management system, for instance, historically you had to develop some code and go out and install it on different computers and go get your clients. Well, now you can set up something in the cloud and your time to market is much quicker. So there's an explosion of CAD solutions. And then there's another trend that's happening in all of this where historically, and I joke sometimes when I talk to IT professionals that facilities, to play on, Spock is, the final frontier that we're looking at. And as we talk about simple IT has automated all sorts of things. Facilities isn't mission critical. Our bank checks are mostly routed from, who we work for to our bank, and they just show up, and all those things went first. So facilities is kind of catching up, and this concept of data integration, which was standard in the IT world now for about 20 years, is starting to hit facilities where 5 years ago, your space management system really wouldn't integrate with your energy management system and your asset management system and your maintenance management system. The hooks just weren't there. It wasn't that it was capable, but those things have kind of caught up. If we move on and we talk about the Internet of Things.
Actually, before you go there, just real quick.
Oh, sorry, sir.
No. Vendor solutions. We're at over 100% of people using a vendor solution. I think that deserves to be at least pointed out that, yes, we know that that is there, but I would say, is it correct the saying that if people are using a EAM and an IWMS or something like that, they fill out two different checkboxes, so one person can have multiple entries for this, because most owners do or do not use more than one system?
That's a very good point. So as I talk about, kind of use the IWMS, which is the catch-all that will do all things for everybody, most organizations use a whole collection of different systems. So your BIM integration isn't with just one system to help manage your facility. It is with a collection of facilities. And one of the newer trends that's been the last couple of years is we're trying to save money. And I'm going to joke now, being green, the amount of energy that facilities use, our houses, our corporate facilities, our universities, are tremendous. So there's a big boom in leveraging energy management solutions. So, Joe, yeah, that's probably another reason why that's expanding, because most people will have several.
Yeah, which kind of ties into the whole IoT if you're talking about energy, right?
Yes. So IoT continues to increase, and we're starting to do lots of different interesting projects around this. And the best way I explain this to people is we all drive our car, right? And if we're not taking care of our car, the check engine light pops on. And usually, if we respond to the check engine light, we can solve problems before they get worse. Revit and IoT are kind of a game changer. Revit provides a container, so to speak, of your building or buildings to where your assets are, to where you can start put sensors around. And I'll use a university, for example, right? You've got hundreds of buildings, and you've got these students running around, and there's a wireless network across the whole place. But as we talk about that check engine light, a university has hundreds of HVAC units running across the rooftops of their campus. They don't have a check engine light on them. Well, as we start to talk about IoT, sensors continue to come down in cost, and we're starting to see that equipment is starting to ship with some sort of communication in it where it can hit a wireless network. And if a machine, a piece of equipment isn't running at maximum speed, there are different checks that can be sent to hit that check engine light and say, hey, can you come take a look? Something's wrong. I'm not running as efficiently as I am. And it may be as simple as, hey, the filter got all caught up with there was a storm and there's a bunch of dust in the filter that shouldn't be there, and the equipment's not running efficiently, and it's helping organizations to do a little bit more predictive maintenance versus reactive, where historically they get up and when they do their 3 or 6 or 12-month PM on a piece of equipment, they'd realize that there's a problem, but that had after been a point where it hadn't been running too efficiently, or, in a worst case example, the filter got so messed up the air couldn't go through and the fan blew out. There are also all sorts of interesting things happening with things like indoor mapping and asset location. So one of the projects that I'm working specifically on right now is with Apple, where we're doing a pilot. Apple recently released an integration between the Apple mapping software and Revit, where you can take a Revit model, you can embed it within the Apple mapping infrastructure, and then you can do that for wayfinding and for location of assets. And as I'm doing this, there's some interesting things like, hey, I'm at a hospital, right, and I want to get to a patient room. How do I do that? I'm at university, and I'm at Adams Hall, and I've got to get to the chemistry lab in another hall across campus. How do I do that? So the wayfinding is starting to include not just the stuff that kind of we're used to. Right now, right, we jump in our cars and plug into our GPS where do we want to go, but it's going to a deeper level, but also for locating assets. And as we start to talk about locating assets, kind of two ideas to make people think. One example I give people are hospitals. We all have been in a patient room in a hospital at some point, which usually is not a fun thing for any of us. But if you look around, most of the assets are on wheels. A tremendous problem hospitals have is finding where all those things those are. we did another pilot on something that I thought was incredibly mundane, where an organization couldn't find their ladders. So they put monitors on their ladders so someone could find out where they were. And initially they thought they needed to buy a whole bunch more ladders because they could never find them. Well, once they realized they could find them, they were there. So as we talk about IoT, and these are just a couple different examples, there's going to be an explosion. And if you think about this, facilities, almost all of them have an existing wireless network that can be run. I've been involved in IoT projects for over 10 years. I still can't understand why people think that the blender talking to the refrigerator, to the toaster in the kitchen is going to make sense. Some smart person may be thinking about something that I'm not, but as I talk to, from a facilities perspective of saying, hey, where are my assets that are on wheels that I can't find, or are things running efficiently, there's going to be an explosion of this. And if you think about it from an infrastructure standpoint, the facility's already invested in some type of wireless network, so to deploy the sensors isn't incredibly difficult.
Cool. Which gets us to that part of saying there's trends and it was growing, shrinking, growing, wherever it's at, and that's great, but what are the problems then of being able to get BIM and FM integrated? So we asked a question that was, what are your challenges in providing BIM to owners, to the AEC firms? And we left it as an open answer place where we could fill in whatever we want to. And the things that we're seeing here are the different types of answers that came through. Now, I took the information from that and took the ones that were most common. Now, some of the things like knowledge, throwing that in through there. If somebody said something about training, if somebody had an item in there of don't know what I'm doing, things like that, just grouped it together into that one thing called knowledge. But these are the major items that came back inside that survey of what are the problems. If we have a model, I'm an AEC firm, I have a model, what's the problem with getting this for the owner to work with? Within these items, if this is the top slice of those types of responses we got from the hundreds of people that replied, the ones that really jump out to me as far as, I guess, what we got in this survey plus what I also experienced when just chatting with people every day, every week, the ones that jump out to me tend to be budget and protecting intellectual data. The others here are absolutely in there. Not my scope is generally the piece of saying, well, hey, nobody asked for it, so I'm not providing it. I'm not going to do that for free. I'm not going to give away what I've got. I'm not going to give away my intellectual data. There's a question. In different places, it's been resolved amongst specific owners and providers, and in other places it's not. There's no one overarching solution that everybody's accepting right now, and maybe that's part of it too, of the qualification that everybody's accepting. But if I'm an architect, if I'm an engineer, and I put all of this knowledge into a model, what am I able to do to protect my intellectual property that I've put into that? Who owns that as an intellectual property? When an owner pays an architect, engineer, contractor for a building, are they paying for that IP in addition to the final physical building that gets constructed or modified or whatever? Yeah, how's that going? And from a budget side, we've got a budget to create a building, but if I have an owner that's asking me for all this extra data, I don't have time to put all that extra data in there. If I'm an architect or engineer, I don't know how realistic it is going to be that the data I put into a model right now is going to be the data that's done, that's in the model when it's finished with construction. So why should I bother putting in some information that takes me more time than I had accounted for because I didn't know about this BIM requirement ahead of time? Where's that going? So these are the types of things that are working through it. As I'm looking at it, there are some items in here, in particular, owners don't have BIM software. That is a bit of a technological issue. If you're using one of those homegrown systems or you're managing your facility by Excel, how much can we get to that system from BIM? I'd say there's probably a surprising amount we can do, but there's sometimes some technological issues. What I'm seeing in this, and when we're looking at the challenges from the AEC firm, is it's more, we'll say, structural within the AECO, the buildings industry, of how do we go about this? How do we make sure that everybody is getting something productive out of this versus just trying to give away more, give away more so I can actually win the job? That's what I'm seeing as the overall trend as we're looking at this from the AEC side. And Peter, from the owner end.
So as we look at owners, the one that popped up first is the most common one I get to is people don't know where to start because it can be quite overwhelming. There are all sorts of different aspects of BIM. So first is, and BIM is wonderful, and in a perfect world, we can sit down with an organization and explain very quickly how you can have very valuable information in the model that can flow into the facilities management tools to help an owner better manage their facilities over time. And while this is all nice and wonderful, most owner organizations are having a hard enough time keeping their stick AutoCAD drawings up to date. Forget about looking at a model which can have a lot more information. So one of the things I was recently co-presenting with Joe Porostowski actually earlier this week at the Canadian at CanBIM, which is a group up in Canada, about BIM, and Joe said something very smart. When I talk to an organization, I want them to jump in. I'm a technology evangelist. I can see the value in this. I can put all this together. But I loved one of the things that Joe said in his presentation, in that their story with BIM, he's been working on this for 9 years now, and he is constantly tweaking it. And one of the concepts he came is, hey, we started small. So in their case, they knew that BIM would create some value, and they weren't sure what to start. And one of the things they did, which was interesting, they said, you know what, we're going to start converting some of our existing facilities into BIM. And the reason they did that was to say, hey, let's look at BIM and what it can do and where we can get our ROI. And once they had that down and they understood how the tool was, they then started looking forward, and now there's a lot of work going on with them as they go through their personal BIM journey, where they're at level 4 of their BIM standard for working with external organizations. Joe pointed out yesterday he's proud. Their BIM standard is getting reduced roughly a page every time they just released level 4. And part of the takeaway, that I had from that is they knew what they wanted in the model, and they were able to communicate that succinctly. But part of this, as you start to think about building different data sets, if you start with a data set and you have core elements in place that aren't difficult to identify. So if you're an organization, you got to track your stuff, which I use as a very technical term in stuff. But if you think about it, it boils down to 2 simple data elements at the beginning. It's, hey, what are my facilities? So my building, my floor, my room, which are very basic data elements if you think about it. And then within those spaces, what are the assets that you want to track? So my encouragement as you talk to owners is you don't need to go and convert your entire campus and buy a bunch of software and put in a BIM standard in place and start integrating with all these systems. It's kind of a multi-year process, and if you kind of take it slowly and use the simple concept that we've all heard a million different times in a million different ways of beginning with the end in mind to say, okay, hey, there's some new technology. We'd like to do this. There's a cost associated with it. There are going to be different benefits for different organizations. And where do we think we can find some sort of value? And those are the organizations that we see that are successfully implementing BIM. Going back to the comment earlier where I think things have stepped back a little earlier, I'm part of another association that I'm going to leave nameless because I'm going to poke fun at them. And I talked to the president a couple of years ago, and I said, last year, and I said, hey, does everyone, all the owners of the organizations have standards now? And she goes, absolutely. And I said, tell me, how many of you are enforcing your standards? And she said, and truth of the matter, it was a handful. And part of this thing where I associate there's kind of been a bit of a hiccup, BIM's gone from a buzzword, so to speak, and people are starting to understand that there's a paradigm shift and there's work involved. When the AEC community went from CAD to BIM, they had to rework the way they did things. It was a paradigm shift of a different way of doing business. And the owners need to do the same thing. And if we think about any paradigm shift or change we've been through in our lives, change takes time. Change also has a little bit of pain associated with it, and often there's a level of trial and error. So one of the things I say when I talk to owners, it's okay to have a moving target. You don't want to have a tremendous moving target, but if you start and begin with the end in mind, you can start with a simpler standard and roll out a BIM across your organization, and you can add complexity to it over time.
Cool. Which kind of leads into the idea of what are people delivering? Going back to exactly what Peter was saying there, the whole list of things of what do people deliver as part of their BIM deliverables, the major ones sitting here. Yes, models are being delivered, over 50%, but that's eclipsed by everything else except for point clouds. Because of what can we integrate with? What can we do right now? If we look at just the idea of CAD drawings, over 70% of deliverables are still CAD drawings. Some of that might be because the facility systems that are in place don't have a direct integration with Revit, so we've got to push it to CAD to be able to get it out. Almost everybody, over 90%, are still pushing with PDFs. Those are the standards that we've got within our industry. So as much as we are pushing and running with all these things, it's still out there. DWG and PDF deliverables are happening much more often than a BIM or a model deliverable. As Peter had mentioned, with Ohio State, they've got so much of their campus already converted, but those models that exist in Revit for almost 90% of their campus still has to be produced as a DWG or still has to be produced as a PDF at some point in time so it can be consumed by end users, by software, by other types of things. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not possible. You've got different pieces of software, whether it's in different IWMS systems or, heck, even IMAGINiT has a piece of software out there called Clarity that can work with those Revit models and directly provide information and feedback and good data as we're looking at it. But just because the solutions are there doesn't mean that people have stepped up to the plate to work with integrating it. Change is hard. Change takes time, can be difficult. But while we're going through that change, we still need to make sure we're delivering those traditional deliverables. So I expect that we'll continue to see the model deliverables grow more and more over time, but it's going to be decades before we've got something that is CAD drawings or PDFs are below 20%. It's just going to be what do people need to consume? Let's make sure they've got that, because the end goal in mind is we've got to serve the consumers. So until we can change what or how they're going about the consumption, we need to make sure we're dealing with both. So that still is our reality. I see that being something for a while. It'll continue to be that way. So what can we do, Peter?
And an important thing, just to comment on your slide, while we'll talk about all the wonderfulness of BIM, BIM's overkill for a lot of people. So a PDF is quite fine for someone that needs to potentially gather some simple floor plan information or some simple asset information. And then as we talk about BIM, models are big and require more expensive machines to run. So also as we talk about that, it's not a complete takeaway, but it's the fact that the model can create all of these outputs. And so you kind of have, your different strokes for different folks. And one of the things you definitely don't want to do is train your entire organization how to use BIM. It's just not going to make sense because they're not going to work in it regularly enough. They'll just get lost.
Fair enough.
So as we talk about what this means, there are three positions you can take. The first thing is, hey, you can say, hey, the bandwagon's going. I want to get on track, and you can get on different levels of getting on track. You don't need to go from 0 to 60. Walking before you run definitely works. Sometimes crawling before you run makes sense. As technology moves, though, this is rapidly gaining momentum, and IoT is going to have a big push on this. So just watch as you're doing things. You definitely might not want to be way out in the front because there are certain things that need to be solved in this technology adoption, but you don't want to be playing, catch up from the perspective. And then the third thing is if you've got the resources and the capabilities, take the lead. So these are inherent technologies. They're being invested in. I can do a whole presentation where I mentioned earlier there's a whole flood of systems in this and IT integration coming. And one of the next levels of automation where tremendous efficiencies can be gained is in managing our facilities.
So coming back then, it really is two different ways we can look at things as well. There's all sorts of different angles that we're trying to throw out here as we're getting the survey results. But the first step is if you've got standards that apply to design versus construction versus facilities management versus whatever, if you've got those and you're solid with what you are doing, you're internally competent in where that's going, we need to start looking at sharing. Work with each other for what those next step things are. How can we do these things together better? Now, qualification for that is we're talking about sharing. We're not saying give away the farm. And that comes maybe as a positive and negative to different people depending on how you're interpreting and receiving that. But the idea of sharing means we're not giving everything away. There is some intellectual property that goes into what we've got. So how can we share and do it productively for everybody? And then if you don't have any of those standards yet, well, you got to share anyway. The world that we're in today doesn't matter where you're at in that world. If you want to be working better between AEC firms and facilities management, we want to start bridging that gap better to have better buildings, better business relationships, better you name it. There is that level of sharing that's required. You can't get away from it. Again, I'm going to say not necessarily giving away what we can get for quid pro quo. Let's do what we can, but we've got to get to that sharing level.
So as you start to talk about as we move from building design all the way to building operations in BIM, if you look at building design, the architectural community is far ahead. And again, I didn't mean to poo-poo them earlier. Or kind of, if you think about a lot of the architects that are adopting BIM, they're kind of the laggards if you look at a technology adoption curve. And there's a certain amount of efficiency to be gained there. And Joe could explain this much better than I could. One of the things I liked about the survey, it reflected that there's even greater dollars to be realized in building construction. And there are all sorts of things that happen as you start to talk about construction. If we just think about simple things like waste and if we could do better planning. And as you talk about things, and you kind of talk about, explosion, you could have a little explosion called BIM. You could have a bigger explosion called BAM. But as you start to talk about operating those facilities over the lifetime of the facility, we hit what I call the kaboom. And when I present live usually, and I can't do this on a webinar because the last thing I want to do is get someone upset that's much larger than our organization. But remember Marvin the Martian when he would send his little, the comics we saw in the 80s and the 70s, and he'd send he'd shoot something, and he'd look through his little telescope and go, "Where's the kaboom? Where's the earth-shattering kaboom?" There's a tremendous value to be realized in BIM in helping organizations maintain their facilities over time.
Absolutely. And so as we're going through it all, and so seems to be my crutch phrase for the presentation, it's all about embracing that idea of technology. If we are going to be sharing, we need to be sharing at the same level, which means at different stages, different people will need to embrace the idea of technology or development in something that you weren't doing before, whether it's reality capture, cloud-based data management, facilities solutions, building operations, getting some of the mapping, all those different types of things going on. It's important for us to get up to speed with what these tools are and then start using them so you can profit from those pieces as you're working through it all. The idea of starting with that end in mind is the concept of, well, like if you're designing a building, you're just not going up to somebody saying, hey, I'll design you a building, and then you make something and see if they like it at the end. Now we have this investigation process to figure out what is the building going to be serving, where is it going to be located, all these different things. Same thing applies here when we're talking about that BIM and FM integration. What do we need to integrate? Who's capturing the data? Who's going to be responsible for maintaining the data? Going through all that. What programs, what facility solutions, what BIM CAD solutions are we going to be using? How can they integrate? Do they integrate at all? All these things need to be investigated, and we get there by embracing our way through that idea of technology.
And the last thing I want to point out is BIM doesn't need to be daunting. It gets a little complicated in their different ways. You could look at implementing it in your organization, and again, what works for organization A might not work for organization B. There definitely will be similarities, but which end of the spectrum do you go? Do you go left? Do you go right?
Or forget all that. Do you need to go backwards, forwards, up and down, depending on which direction you see this coming around? But there's many ways to get there. High school English teacher, there's many ways to get to my house. It's a quote that I'll never forget, ever. It doesn't have to be daunting. There's many ways we can accomplish what we're looking for. It's a matter of let's talk about things. Let's get out there. Let's share what we can with each other. Not giving, but let's share what we can so that we can get ourselves to a spot where we're not operating in some sort of lose-lose situation. We're not getting confrontational with each other or whatever. Some level of confrontation is unavoidable. We're human. That's life, whatever. But we also don't want to get into a space where we're leveraging ourselves so that we win to the detriment of everybody else, or we're fully sacrificing ourselves for the advantage of somebody else. Lose, win, lose. Okay, it's an incremental step above losing everybody, but what we really want to get to, I keep on hitting the wrong key, is to the idea of a win-win scenario. We've got to communicate to get ourselves to that step where we can reach out, communicate, share, work with these things together, and get beyond that hump that is stopping us from doing more with BIM in a facilities world, whether it's technology, interpersonal communication, integration between technology, understanding what we've got to get and run it through a Kobe export from Revit to go into Facility System X. It's all about different levels of, data integration is really what it comes to. And I will say from the pitch of what all this means to you and why IMAGINiT, this is part of what we do. We are here to help our customers get into a place where you are in a position to succeed. You're in a position to thrive, whether it is through the traditional types of things that we might look at from a software training or support mechanism. If there's some level of consulting to be able to help communicate between owner and design firm or vice versa. Our purpose in being in here is to work with you through any number of these things to get you in that spot to thrive. And Peter, last thoughts from your side as well.
So one of the things on win-win that I like to point out is from an AEC perspective, a lot of the owners need help. And you can increase the value of your organization. A lot of the owner organizations I know that use BIM and are using BIM have spent more money with their AEC partners. So let me go back to that. They're happy to spend more money with their AEC partners if they can find a way to get more value out of all the fine work the AEC people are working on to help them make decisions down the line. And, as you talk about costs and different things like that, there's definitely there's a benefit in that. And at the end of the day, kind of I had down there is the last point, part of, what I do a lot, I joke when I do my bio a lot that I'm an AEC owner therapist. The number of times I've been in a room and helped facilitate a conversation between the two of them to help ask questions. Part of it, though, is this last point of data integration. And at IMAGINiT here, I head up our facilities management group, and 10 years ago, our core business was implementing a handful of facility management systems that we work with. Today, that is not our core business. Our core business is working with organizations to help to integrate data between construction management systems and facility management systems and all sorts of management systems. And as you start to talk about this from an IT perspective, data integration isn't a big deal or it's not hard. Where it gets a little kludgy here, if you think about it, Revit and the BIM authoring tools are design tools. They're not database-based tools. And on the other end of the spectrum, the maintenance management systems and CAFM systems and IWMS and energy management systems, they're largely database-based systems. And there's a slight paradigm shift in realizing that a room's looked at a little differently, but it isn't that difficult. And also, as I do this is the first year, I should kind of mention, the last 4 years, we just kind of did a survey and presented our findings and saw where we are. We saw that the adoption was increasing. And I added this as a very slight sales pitch here to say to all of you, hey, this is something we can help you out with. Ironically, you don't need us. So if you're an owner and you're working on a project with an AEC firm, ask them what they're doing with BIM. You just start having a conversation. I think you'll find some of these, some benefit in that. You'll find some common ground. At the end of the day, everyone's about being more efficient, adding more value to your clients from an AEC perspective, and the owners are looking for more value from their vendors.
Awesome. With that, I'll say thank you very much to everybody for taking some time to join us. We've just got a very short amount of time before the top of the hour where we'll certainly be willing to go past that to help answer some questions for you as we're going through here. If you've got questions beyond this, please certainly reach out to us, your local reps, to IMAGINiT.com, wherever. Where can we help you get to a spot where you're better than you were today? So thank you very much. Let's open it up to the questions.